Ever find yourself kind of marveling at how much we know about the world? I mean, the way we can explain things, predict things, it's also systematic. It really makes you wonder, where did this whole way of thinking even come from?
Yeah, that's a huge question, isn't it?
Well, you sent us something super interesting to dig into. Some notes from a lecture by Professor Guilherme Benko all about the philosophy of science.
Ah, yes, Professor Benko.
So what we're going to try and do in this deep dive today is trace that journey, that historical thread from those early Greek philosophers all the way to, well, the birth of modern science as we know it. We're going to paint a picture of how the scientific method itself came to be. How does that sound?
I think that's a fantastic goal. It's not something that just appeared out of nowhere.
Right.
Professor Benko's notes, which, by the way, you told us came from an audio recording, are a really great resource for tackling this question of, well, the origins of scientific thinking.
Okay, so let's get into it. Professor Benko starts off by saying something pretty interesting. We don't actually know exactly when the scientific method came about. There wasn't like a big announcement or a specific date.
Right, it wasn't an aha moment. It was a process, wasn't it?
It was. So what we're going to do here is visualize that evolution, that process of development. We're going to map it out in a way that makes sense.
That's a crucial first step to kind of appreciate what modern science even is. It's not this, eternal, unchanging truth. It's something humans built. It really took shape during those periods we know as the Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
So to get a handle on science today, we have to go way back.
We have to look at the groundwork, the philosophy that came centuries before. It's like, if you want to understand a tree, you got to look at the roots, right?
I like that. Professor Benko uses this analogy that I think is really helpful. He calls it an anamnese of thought. Now, I know that might sound kind of jargony.
It does sound a bit technical.
It does, but think about it like this. When you're trying to remember something you've forgotten, you kind of dig around in your past, looking for clues, right, to piece it together. That's what we're doing with scientific thought. We're looking back at how humans have thought about the world, about knowledge, to figure out where our current way of thinking comes from.
It's a great way to put it. By looking at how these ideas developed, we can start to see, well, all these different threads that ultimately wove together to become what we now call the scientific method.
And Professor Benko even gives us a little preview of what those kind of characteristics of modern science are, right? Like having an empirical basis.
Yes, and he really drives this home that it's all about observation. He actually says empiricism is the experience. It's the experience. It's the observation.
Repetition for emphasis.
Exactly. He also mentions falsifiability. Now, that's a concept we often link with Karl Popper, right? And the importance of logic, of logical principles.
Now, he does say we'll get into those specific in more detail later in a future deep dive, maybe. For now, for this deep dive with this material, we're setting the stage. We're exploring those roots.
The foundation.
The foundation, exactly. And so, where do we begin?
Well, where else? Ancient Greece, the birthplace of so much of Western thought.
Seems like we always end up back in ancient Greece.
It's foundational. Professor Benko highlights these thinkers called the pre-Socratics, and they have different schools of thought: the Ionic, Italic, Eleatic, the plurality, and the eclectic. What's really important about them is their focus. They were trying to understand the external world, the nature of reality.
So a shift away from just accepting things as they are, a shift away from mythological explanations.
Right. They were asking what and how, trying to find rational, natural explanations. Now, later on, Socrates comes along, and he kind of turns that focus inward, right? Towards ourselves, questions about ethics, self-knowledge. But these pre-Socratic guys, they were looking outward.
So they were figuring out the universe before they figured out us.
In a way, yes. And that move from myth to seeking natural answers, that's a key moment. Professor Benko mentions some big names, Thales of Miletus, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Zeno. There's even that story about Zeno refusing to bow down to a tyrant, which kind of makes him feel more relatable, right?
It makes them all a little more human.
It does. It's crucial to understand that even though their ideas might seem simple to us now, what they were doing was revolutionary. They were looking for rational explanations for why things are the way they are. Professor Benko reminds us of the huge impact of Greek philosophy. It was the bedrock for the Roman Empire and influenced Western thought for centuries.
And then we come to this amazing intellectual lineage. Socrates, his student Plato, and then Plato's student Aristotle.
It's like a direct line, a passing of the torch, each one building on what came before. Professor Benko even includes that great quote. I think it's often attributed to Newton, but Carl Sagan made it really famous about standing on the shoulders of giants. It really highlights how our understanding isn't just out of nowhere. It's built on everything that came before.
Do you happen to remember the exact quote?
I think I do. If we have come this far, it is because we were seated on the shoulders of giants.
That's it. powerful stuff.
It is, and Socrates and Plato, they made such important contributions, especially in epistemology. Professor Benko breaks it down for us. Episteme, which is knowledge. Logia comes from logos, which is the theory of knowledge. That is, it is the path of knowledge. They were consumed with understanding what knowledge is and how we know things at all.
So it's like asking, what does it even mean to know something?
Exactly. How can we be sure that our understanding is accurate? Those are the big questions they were wrestling with.
And that's essentially what epistemology is, right? The study of the nature, the methods, and the limits of knowledge.
Yes, figuring out how we know what we know, and if that knowledge is actually valid. Professor Benko mentions Plato's allegory of the cave as a classic example of how he explored these ideas, the whole idea of perception and the nature of reality.
And then we have Aristotle, who is a student of Plato.
Arguably laid an even wider foundation for natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, as well as for Western philosophy as a whole.
And Professor Benko really points to the importance of logic, right? Like, what makes a thought valid? And the answer is, it's the structure of the thought itself, the logic behind it. That's what gives it support, makes it hold together.
Without that, you end up with, well, nonsense. And these philosophers, they were masters of logic. They built these systems of reasoning that let them explore ideas and really pick apart arguments.
And that was crucial, right, to get to more rigorous ways of investigating the world.
Exactly. And from there, Professor Benko takes us to the Stoic philosophers.
Okay, the Stoics.
They were around 262 BCE, folks like Marcus Aurelius, and interestingly, another Zeno. It's important to remember this isn't the same Zeno we talked about earlier, the pre-Socratic one.
Two Zenos.
Right, so the Stoics, what's fascinating is that they expanded what logic could do. They didn't just focus on the structure of arguments, they incorporated epistemology. They were directly asking questions about the validity of knowledge, how we get it.
So they were pushing towards a more empirical way of thinking, based on experience?
Exactly. And that was a big step. The real breakthrough of Stoicism was recognizing that sensory experience is a valid place to start building knowledge.
And this is where our second Zeno comes in.
Yes, Zeno the Stoic. He's the one who really articulates this idea that our sensory impressions, what we see, hear, touch, these are a reliable guide to the truth about the world. Professor Benko even quotes him. He says, Zenon developed a fundamentally empiricist thesis, that is, fundamentally of experience obtained through experience, according to which certain impressions and all accessible by your common sensory equipment are an infallible guide to external truths.
That sounds like a major turning point.
It was. Professor Benko calls it the starting point for the scientific understanding of the world. It marks this real shift towards valuing what we can observe through our senses as the basis of knowledge.
It's like saying, to understand reality, we have to actually look at it, experience it.
Precisely. And he gives a great example, the invention of the microscope. Before that, people just assumed life could arise out of nowhere, right? Spontaneous generation.
Just appearing.
But with the microscope, suddenly you could see these tiny organisms, these little creatures involved. It completely changed our understanding. So this was a key moment, this recognizing the importance of what we can observe with our senses.
Our senses as a tool for understanding.
Exactly. And this focus on empirical evidence, on observation, becomes absolutely fundamental to the scientific method.
Okay, so we're moving along on our journey. Where does Professor Benko take us next?
He takes us to the medieval period, which he describes as a time with much less access to study and reading, most of it being concentrated within the church.
Right, so intellectual life was happening within religious institutions, but within that context, we have figures like St. Thomas Aquinas, right, 13th century, a Dominican priest, a philosopher, and a theologian. What was his contribution to all of this?
Aquinas was a giant. He really tried to bridge the gap between faith and reason. He wanted to understand the scriptures and religious doctrine through logic and philosophy. He was trying to build a system where faith and reason could work together, support each other.
So he was trying to use the tools of logic and philosophy to make sense of religious beliefs. Professor Benko mentions that his approach, called Thomism, started with things we can learn through our senses and our intelligence. And from there, he built this logical path towards the idea of a supreme creator.
It's a fascinating way of trying to reconcile the observable world with theological ideas.
Trying to find that harmony. But this approach, it wasn't universally accepted, right?
It wasn't. Professor Benko introduces the nominalists. They were a kind of reaction to this dominant way of thinking.
What did they argue for?
They were advocating for a separation between faith and science. And Professor Benko is careful to point out that this wasn't necessarily about, like, hostility between the two. It was partly about trying to limit the political power of the church at that time.
It's a good reminder that these intellectual debates are never happening in a vacuum.
Never. They're always within a certain social and political context. Professor Benko really emphasizes that we need to understand that historical and social setting for each period.
He uses this analogy, it's kind of funny, about trying to explain an air fryer to a medieval peasant.
Yeah, that's a good one. It really illustrates how hard it can be to understand something completely outside your own worldview, your own context.
It does. Professor Benko also briefly mentions the influence of the early church, how the Roman Empire adopted Christianity, and how religion was sometimes, well, used for political purposes.
All of this forms the backdrop for the intellectual debates that were happening in the Middle Ages. And while Professor Benko doesn't get into a ton of detail in this particular excerpt, he does mention that he goes on to really explore the premises of modern scientific thought.
So how all these threads we've been talking about come together to give us the scientific method?
Exactly. So this deep dive has really been about laying the groundwork for that understanding.
Okay, so let's do a super quick recap. We started with those pre-Socratic philosophers looking out at the natural world. Then we went through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, all those giants of logic and reason. We saw that first spark of empiricism with the Stoics, this idea that our senses matter. Then through the medieval period, those attempts to reconcile faith and reason, thinkers like Aquinas, and then the push for separation, the nominalists.
That's it. And thanks to Professor Benko's overview, you now have a better understanding of that journey, that long and winding path that led to the way we think about science today.
And hopefully, as you were listening, you had a few of those aha moments, seeing how all these different pieces connect, how they build on each other. We really wanted to give you that historical context without it feeling like, a boring history lecture.
And as you think about this more, think about how those early debates about what knowledge is, how much we can trust our senses, how reason and belief fit together, think about how they're still relevant today.
Still playing out in different ways.
Exactly. What assumptions do we still carry with us from those early periods of intellectual history? How do they shape how we approach science, how we understand the world now?
Lots to ponder. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive.
It was a pleasure.
And until next time, keep those brains buzzing.
Keep wondering, keep questioning.